That's part of the problem of the approach that President Trump has been taking since the very beginning. This idea that somehow the two sides are to blame equally, or even worse, that Ukraine is to be blamed more for a war that Russia started. And I think that's ultimately the only way that this war is going to end, if we understand that there is one side that has been the victim, the other side that is the aggressor.
Now, President Trump's hopes of reaching a peace deal for Ukraine have been dealt a further blow after Russia said that the latest counter-proposals from European leaders are not constructive and don't work for Moscow. The Ukrainian delegation briefed President Zelensky about the talks earlier today after returning to Kyiv from Geneva. They described the latest version of the peace plan as more realistic. Meanwhile, the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt tonight insisted that the US is being even-handed to both countries after earlier criticism of the plan.
I would point any critics to the words of the Ukrainians yesterday, in which they said that they feel very positive about this plan. They've been very involved. They have had direct input on the language of this plan, and that we are in direct communication and correspondence with them. Any idea, let me just finish with this, the idea that the United States of America is not engaging with both sides equally in this war to bring it to an end is a complete and total fallacy.
Well, Ivo Daalder, former US ambassador to Nato, is now a senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center and joins us now. Good evening to you, Ivo.
Good evening. Glad to be on.
Well, it's good to have you with us. We're hearing the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, there, insisting that the US is being even-handed in this. What do you make of where we've reached in this process?
I think we may have averted a disaster, but let me say may, because we really don't know. This was not the way to deal with the war. A 28-point peace plan that was drawn up by Steve Witkoff, the president's golfing buddy, who has now become the peace envoy extraordinaire. He is working together with the Russians to draw up this peace plan. He had no input from the Ukrainians. It was not being discussed at all with the Europeans, and indeed wasn't even discussed with many people inside Washington. That was the plan that was presented to President Zelensky on Thursday as a take it or leave it in the next week. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians said, well, we'd like to talk about that, but this plan's not going to work for us. Let's talk about the way we can modify it. And the discussions that happened yesterday in Geneva with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as European and EU officials, perhaps has put us into a situation where the worst has been avoided. That doesn't mean we're anywhere close to a peace deal or even a ceasefire. That requires the consent of the two parties who are fighting, not just a willingness by the United States to engage in the negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, because we had that original 28-point plan produced, as you say, in those talks between Steve Witkoff and a Russian negotiator, which many people saw as amounting to basically a complete capitulation by Ukraine. It would have had to give up territory, agree to limit its forces, give up its most powerful weapons, agree to having no foreign soldiers on its territory, agree to never join NATO, and so on. We know that since those talks involving President Zelensky, European leaders, and Marco Rubio, that there's a new version, and apparently it's gone down to 19 points. Have you got any sense of how big the changes have been, where we've got to?
I don't have the details, or the details haven't been leaked or announced in any form. I can imagine that some of the things that were changed would be that anything where the Europeans would have to act or have to assent, that the Europeans would be given the right to do so. Again, in the 28-point plan, lots of things Europe had to do, including releasing the Russian assets that they have been frozen and provide security guarantees of which they weren't part in the negotiation. So I think that's one part of it. I think the others are related to territory. This idea that somehow the territory that Russia has illegally seized through war should now be ceded to Russia. That's something Mr. Witkoff and indeed an earlier peace plan that was presented to Ukraine advocated. That's the Russian position. It's never going to be the Ukrainian position, and I don't think it's ever going to be the European position. So I imagine that is gone. I also think there is probably some more detail on what the security guarantees are that the United States would offer, including the possibility of ultimately Ukraine joining NATO. What's at stake here is not just ending this war. What's at stake is the political reason for where the war is taking place, which is the aggression by Russia against Ukraine. I don't like it when the United States is even-handed. There is nothing to be even-handed between a victim of the war and an aggressor on the war. That's part of the problem of the approach that President Trump has been taking since the very beginning. This idea that somehow the two sides are to blame equally, or even worse, that Ukraine is to be blamed more for a war that Russia started. And I think that's ultimately the only way that this war is going to end, if we understand that there is one side that has been the victim, the other side that is the aggressor.
Yeah, and we're hearing now Yuri Yushakov, who's a Kremlin foreign policy aide, has said that the latest proposals drawn up in conjunction with the Europeans do not work for us. I mean, it looks as though the Russians are prepared to reject this. I mean, do you think that President Trump is prepared to stand up to President Putin? He's threatened him repeatedly, hasn't he, with all kinds of tougher sanctions and so on, but has never actually taken any steps to stand up to President Putin. I mean, do you think that Russian rejection could just scupper the whole plan?
Well, I don't see how Russia and Ukraine are going to agree. The war is ongoing because neither side is willing to end the fighting, because they are fighting for what they are trying to achieve. In the Russian case, subjugating Ukraine to the will of Moscow. In Ukraine's case, to make sure that it remains an independent, sovereign, and hopefully state with its territory intact. That's why the war hasn't ended. And the president may want to end the war, but it's not going to end the war unless the basics on the ground change. And that means putting pressure on Russia and helping Ukraine. That's how this war ends. We all know that's how the war ends. And the president has not been willing to do that, except these new oil sanctions, which, by the way, were supposed to have gone into effect on Friday. And if those sanctions are truly enforced, if the secondary sanctions that he has threatened on China and on India are truly enforced, then perhaps there is a way to change Russian calculation. But until and unless that happens, we're going to be stuck where we are, a fight for the finish between both sides who don't want to give in.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly, it was fascinating to hear President Zelensky and European leaders who are clearly absolutely aghast at the original proposals, but instead of rejecting them outright, desperate to try to keep on side with President Trump and saying that they were prepared to negotiate. But how great do you think is the risk that President Trump could simply, if the Russians do reject these proposals, then wash his hands of the whole process, walk away and end the support that the US is currently giving, which is quite significant to the Ukrainians?
It's always been possible that he will wash his hands. What the interest is that he has is in ending the war and to be seen to be ending the war, so he can get the Nobel Peace Prize, which he so desperately seeks. So it is possible he walks away. Just to remember, he has already walked away from this conflict. The United States has not provided any aid, economic or military, to Ukraine unless the Europeans paid for it. That has been the case since the day he returned to office in his second term. The United States does provide significant and important intelligence information, and various reports have stated that is not up for negotiation, that intelligence information will continue to be provided. And so that is important. But I do think that there are times when the president just thinks, this is not going to work. He said this is like two kids fighting in a playground. And sometimes they need to continue fighting. I think that's unfair to the Ukrainians, and I think it's an overestimation of what Vladimir Putin is trying to do. But that is the way he sees it, and he may well walk away. Hopefully, if he walks away, he doesn't at the same time undermine Ukraine's capacity for self-defense or weaken the ability of the Europeans to help. After all, it's the Europeans who are paying the money for the weapons that are being transferred, and the United States is making money, as he likes to say, in this war. And I hope that will continue under all circumstances. What I also hope is that the president starts to seriously think about how can he pressure Russia economically and in every other way to come to the table and not say niet to every offer that the Ukrainians might be able to accept.
Ivo H. Daalder, former US ambassador to NATO, now senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center. Really good to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. My pleasure.
Keith got in touch. He says he's disgusted that Trump is fine with showing Putin that attacking other countries gets you rewards. And Dominic says perhaps Zelensky could insist that one of his demands as part of the peace process be that Trump makes a public admission that he doesn't care about the lives of brave Ukrainians that have been lost in their fight and has no conscience about those lives yet to be lost in what also amounts to a defence of European freedom.